Indigenous peoples here, Victoria College. As a meeting place of many nations, Toronto is encompassed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, and this agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee committed them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers are part of this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Before I introduce the speaker for this year's Northrop Frye Center lecture, I'd also like to thank Victoria College, especially Principal Esterhammer, for their continued support of the NFC. Also thank Amelia Bailey, without whom the center would not function at such a high level, and also Jamie Quadros, who we managed to nudge out of retirement to create the poster for today's event. Ursula K. Heise is chair of the Department of English at UCLA. She holds the Marcia H. Howard Term Chair in Literary Studies and serves as interim director of the Lab for Environmental Narrative Strategies, the LENS, at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She's a 2011 Guggenheim Fellow, former president of the ASLE, the Association for Study of Literature and the Environment. Her research and teaching focus on contemporary literature in the environmental humanities, environmental literature, arts and cultures in the Americas, Western Europe, and Japan, literature and science, science fiction, and narrative theory. Her books include Chronoschisms, great name, Time, Narrative, and Postmodernism, from Cambridge, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, from Oxford, Nach der Natur, Das Artensterben und die moderne Kultur, from Suhrkamp, and Imagiging Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species, from U of Chicago Press, which won the 2017 Book Prize for the British Society for Literature and Science. She's the editor of the series Natures, Cultures, and the Environment with Palgrave, co-editor of the series Literature and Contemporary Thought with Routledge, co-editor of the Routledge Companion to the Environmental Humanities, and managing editor of Futures of Comparative Literature, the ACLA Report on the State of the Discipline. I will, as someone who recognizes the amount of work that all of that sort of service goes, Ursula, thank you for all that work that you do to help promote, especially younger scholars and scholars of all types. It's often work that doesn't get thanked, and it's I just wanted to mention that now. Also, she's also the producer and writer of Urban Ark Los Angeles, a documentary created as a collaboration of Lens with the public television station KCET-Link. The talk titled today, Beyond Apocalypse, Climate Change and Urban Narrative. Professor Heise, please take it away.
Thank you, Bob, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Amelia, for taking care of all the logistics. It would be great to be in Toronto on this, first or second day of spring, but that'll be for the future. I've been to your beautiful city in the past and look forward to doing it again. But in the meantime, I'm grateful that technology allows us to be together, at least digitally today. And I'm extremely honored and pleased to be giving the Northrop Frye Center lecture today. So my topic, as Bob has mentioned, is climate justice and urban narrative. As you all know, climate change is the central concept around which a lot of varieties of environmentalism are organized today. It's often equated with the concept of the Anthropocene, although that term originally included a whole set of environmental changes, from pollution and soil erosion to deforestation and biodiversity loss, aside from climate change. And over the last decade, discussions about the Anthropocene and climate change have increasingly been in dialogue and sometimes in conflict with discourses of environmental justice. So let me share my screen here. Oops, hold on, to make sure that I have the sound turned on for some video clips later. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the convergences and conflicts between climate change, climate justice, and how they map onto different kinds of narrative. I'd like to zero in on a particular kind of narrative about climate change that focuses on the city, which a lot of climate change narratives do. And within that, on something that maybe Northrop Frye would call an archetype, although not quite in his sense, which is the flooded city, the city underwater, which recurs in a great deal of fictional and non-fictional narrative about climate change. And what these narratives mostly do is repeat the apocalyptic vision of climate change as leading to the end of civilization as we know it, But there are certain examples of the use of that story template that go beyond and actually propose a different vision that I'd like to zero in on today. So I have two examples, one visual, one textual, that I'd like to discuss with you. One is a Vietnamese science fiction film, the other one, an American science fiction novel. So justice has turned into a central issue for environmentalism. That connection isn't entirely new. In the ecofeminism, social ecology, and the environmental justice movement began to connect struggles for social justice with efforts to conserve natural systems as far back as the 1980s. But from the millennium onward, justice has really evolved into a key concern for a wide spectrum of environmentalisms. So an increasing variety of subfields, such as climate justice, energy justice, the search for a just transition, food justice, spatial justice, and housing justice, seek to connect environmentalism with issues like land use, fossil fuel dependence, agriculture, transportation, the future of work, shelter, and food distribution. Donna Haraway's multi-species environmental justice and multi-species justice, the term that I proposed and which I actually talked about 3 years ago when I was at the University of Toronto, are meant as invitations to think that that reasoning about justice even further beyond human communities. Now, using the term justice in all of these contexts builds a conceptual bridge between the fights against unequal wealth and power on one hand and against environmental degradation on the other. It also links questions of environmental values and decision-making to a tradition of philosophical, political, and legal arguments that runs all the way from Aristotle to John Rawls and beyond. Arguments about environmental justice initially, when they were first formulated in the 80s and 90s, tended to focus on distributive justice in the general framework of Rawls's theory of justice from 1971. So the question of how ecological resources, benefits, and risks are socially distributed. Following David Schlossberg's path-breaking work, it now also routinely includes three other dimensions: participatory justice, capabilities justice, and recognition justice. And I can talk more in detail about these in the Q&A if you're interested. The climate justice movement, as it emerged in the mid-2000s, built on this body of work to address one of the crucial problems in the debates about climate change. And I'm sure you're aware of it, so I'll just summarize it briefly here. Global warming is caused by the gradual buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that started with European industrialization that gradually spread to other continents. So historically and in the present, the global north bears the main responsibility for greenhouse gases, compounded by the disproportionately large consumption of fossil fuel resources in industrialized areas now. Countries in the global south, some of which contribute very few greenhouse gases, suffer the most serious consequences. But because of their own development and economic growth, some of the countries now also contribute in a major way to climate change. I mean, I'm thinking of cases like Brazil, China, and India here. This raises complicated questions about who should shoulder the costs of climate mitigation and adaptation, and how that cost distribution should be computed on the basis of total current emissions, per capita emissions, past emissions, or some other measure. So these considerations are already pretty complex when they arise around expenses for damage that's already happened, say the cost of abating existing air pollution, or adaptation to conditions that have already changed, say rebuilding after wildfires. They get even more complicated when they also include the costs and benefits of mitigation measures for consequences that have yet to materialize. So the costs of managed retreat from coastlines that will be impacted by storms and rising sea levels in the future, for example. And those are just the complications of intragenerational climate justice. That is how we want to think about justice in the context of individuals and communities who are now alive. Considerations of intergenerational justice have additional sets of difficulties. Environmental activists like to appeal to parents' sense of responsibility for their children and their children's children. And they also often refer to the Native American precept that one should consider the consequences of one's actions for the next 7 generations. But planning for a time span of over a century is extremely difficult under any circumstances, but especially given current rates of social and technological change. And while the claims of children are currently being articulated very vocally by people like Greta Thunberg and movements like Extinction Rebellion, the claims of people on our moral consideration who do not yet currently exist are philosophically fraught with difficulty. And all of these issues have been explored in great detail in the literature on environmental justice generally and on climate justice in particular. And I've explored some of them in the context of what I call multi-species justice, that is how to extend ideas of justice to non-human communities and what might be involved in that and what some of the challenges are. I'm not going to rehearse those arguments here. Rather, starting from my professional interest in how narrative patterns shape our thinking about environmental issues, I'd like to explore how ideas about climate justice are associated with particular narrative patterns and how these story templates shape what climate justice means in different cultural contexts. How important stories are for understanding current engagements with climate change has been foregrounded by many theorists and activists, but particularly clearly perhaps by the British geographer Mike Hume. So Mike Hume has argued that that climates change over time, both the physical climates of places, but also the ideologies with which climate is associated. The ways in which the story of climate change and human civilization has been told has also changed over time. We cannot detach the stories we tell about climate from the stories we tell about societies. Now, some researchers have seen this association between climate change and storytelling as problematic. The novelist Amitav Ghosh and the literary critics Adam Trexler and Timothy Clark have all questioned whether currently popular forms of narrative can address the spatial and temporal scales of climate change and the non-human forms of agency it involves. I disagree a bit with their skepticism, and I've tried to show how the temporal and spatial structures of speculative fiction, Cli-Fi in particular, but not only, respond to some of these concerns in an essay that appeared 3 years ago in English Literary History. So today I'd like to zero in on the background of that former research on a different aspect of storytelling about climate change. The question of how narratives about climate change connect the stories of individuals to those about the global social order, and the role that injustice plays in these stories with a particular focus on apocalyptic narrative. So one of the principal settings in climate stories is the city. Now, that makes intuitive sense. Urbanization is an important dimension of the Anthropocene, as I'm sure you're aware. According to UN and WHO data, 2008 was the first year in the history of our species in which more than 50% of humans lived in cities. And that number is projected to rise to at least 70% later in the 21st century. So the major future habitat of humankind is the city. And you see that represented on this graph here by the blue line in the middle, which is the world population, and the other colored lines are urban populations on different continents. And as you can see, I mean, the steepest rises are projected to occur and are already underway in Africa and Asia. As Mike Davis, as well as many other urban political ecologists have pointed out, a lot of the cities in which that increase is occurring are also cities in which sharp socioeconomic inequality is already a daily reality and may become more accentuated in the future. So Davis called this future a planet of slums in his 2006 book. Environmental inequality forms part of that larger reality in that residents of megacities have unequal access to infrastructures of water, electricity, and sanitation. They suffer unequal exposure to pollution, and they have unequal access to housing, green spaces, and biodiversity. These inequalities have been discussed in depth in the literature on present and future urbanisms. So it does make sense that the city would be a central setting for writers and filmmakers who explore scenarios of climate justice. But writers, of course, don't just draw on contemporary reality. They also draw on the literary tradition of the city as a microcosmos of the planet. From the 19th century urban novels of Balzac, Dickens, and Dostoevsky to the modernist urban novels of Joyce, Woolf, Döblin, and Dos Passos, cities have functioned as narrative hubs that bring a large number of otherwise unconnected characters together and explore their stories side by side, often, if not always, precisely to highlight inequalities in modern societies. Contemporary climate writers and directors have tended to focus on that template, but on one particular version of urban narrative, the story of the drowned city. We probably all remember the giant tsunami that rolled over the Statue of Liberty and then into Manhattan in Roland Emmerich's The Day After Tomorrow from 2004, the first Hollywood feature film that addressed climate change. But it was already a major theme in earlier sci-fi narratives like Melbourne Underwater and the Australian novelist George Churner's The Sea and Summer from 1987. And in lots of novels afterwards, for example, Bangkok Underwater in Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl, Helsinki flooded in Antti Tuomainen's Parantaja the Healer, New York flooded in Nathaniel Rich's Odds Against Tomorrow, and then a whole range of cities around the world flooded in Frank Schätzing's German novel Der Schwarm, The Swarm, and Stephen Baxter's British novel Flood from 2008. Nonfiction writers have equally seized on the city underwater as the major synecdoche of climate change. Books like Mark Linus's High Tide and 6 Degrees, Jeff Goodell's The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World are examples of that, or Ashley Dawson's Extreme Cities, David Wallace Wells's The Uninhabitable Earth, and Elizabeth Rush's Rising Dispatches from the New American Shore. All of these books discuss major metropolises as a way to portray the risky futures of climate change, or they focus exclusively on cities. So New York, Miami, Venice, Jakarta keep coming up in these books. And there's nothing wrong with that in terms of fact, of course. We all know that many coastal cities around the globe are in fact at risk from rising waters. But it's less clear that that's the only or the major consequence of climate change for cities. Acute water shortages are equally prominent. You may remember the recent cases of Cape Town, Chennai, and Sao Paulo, where there were major droughts. So are the risks from large-scale wildfires, as the examples of Sydney, Melbourne, and my own hometown of Los Angeles highlight. There are, of course, stories about these scenarios too, but they're not nearly as numerous and dominant as those that feature cities underwater. So one thing that interested me as a narrative analyst was, why is that so? And one reason, I think, is that world-engulfing floods and drowned cities just have a long narrative history that many of the contemporary stories build on. From Plato's Atlantis to Abekubo's Dayon Kampyoki and J.G. Ballard's The Drowned World, so sort of 2,000 years of stories of drowned cities, cities underwater have served as a major trope of the end of historical eras, the cyclical passing of civilizations, divine punishment, the transience of beliefs and cultures, and the eventual downfall of even the most powerful empires. Climate scientists' predictions of increased floods and sea level rise lend a new realism to this age-old story, and the real possibility of flooded cities in the present and future in turn reinforces their symbolic weight. So Jeff Goodell, who, as you remember, he's a journalist, not a fiction writer, in The Water Will Come calls Miami a modern Atlantis in the making. And Ashley Dawson similarly claims that New Orleans will be a new Atlantis surrounded by ever higher levees and with no natural barriers to hold back the slow violence of sea level rise. Atlantis, in Plato's account, you might remember this, sank as a punishment from the gods for its enmity to Athens. For Goodell and Dawson, flooded Miami and New Orleans are punished by political institutions and urban planning processes that missed the mark. Dawson argues that that mark is ultimately neoliberal capitalism. Without overturning capitalism, there's no prospect of any just urban transition out of the fossil fuel age, in his view. Goodell, I think, is more resigned to the complications of realpolitik. His very incisive analysis shows how political interests, federal flood insurance, real estate investment strategies, the astronomical cost of effective seawalls or large-scale buyouts, and the threat of litigation combined with individuals' unwillingness to face coming threats to doom homes, neighborhoods, and entire cities. In the process, Goodell often emphasizes issues of climate justice, how affluent neighborhoods have the means to exert pressure on political authorities and to initiate lawsuits for protective measures, which are quite a few times carried out at public cost, while poor communities do not. So he says in one of his more laconic statements, when it comes to climate change, what matters is elevation and money. But these issues of inequality are oddly erased in his futuristic conclusion. Seawalls will crumble, he says. In a few decades, low-lying neighborhoods will be knee-deep. Modern office buildings and condo towers will lean as the salt water corrodes the concrete foundations and eats at the structural beams. Fish will school in classrooms. Remember that motif, I'll come back to it later on. Religious leaders will blame sinners for the drowning of the city. Journalists will arrive on float planes and write about the return of nature. But mostly, the city will be forgotten, one of many places lost to the attacking sea. In some distant future, someone or some human-like machines may explore the sunken city and find bowling balls, stainless steel knives, gold wedding bands, and ceramic tiles. They may wonder about the people who lived there, what their lives were like, and what they were thinking as their world went under. Now, that sounds like the premise of a sci-fi novel. And in fact, Turner's novel, The Sea in Summer, which I mentioned earlier, starts from a very similar scenario in Melbourne. It's an oddly lyrical evocation of post-apocalypse that contrasts with the more apocalyptic future that Godel starts his book with. Here he projects a devastating hurricane that will destroy Miami in 2037. It's also an ending that emphasizes memory and de-emphasizes the issues of climate justice. Not perhaps a very satisfying ending for a politically activist reader, but one that illustrates how much the fate of the city is identified with the fate of the world, and how much the age-old story of the drowned city can turn into an almost mythical narrative about the inevitability of rising seas and of people's short-sightedness and incompetence, the unavoidability of apocalypse, in other words. But if such visions of the drowned city are typically suspended between pre-apocalyptic anticipation and post-apocalyptic memory, they also sometimes offer starting points for other kinds of narrative. So my first example of that is Nguyen Vo Nam Minh's Nuoc 2030, a film from 2014 that uses that suspension between pre and post-apocalypse to offer a sustained meditation on property, value, and inequality under conditions of climate change. So Nuoc, by the way, is an odd word in Vietnamese. It can mean both country and water, and that ambiguity is, of course, intended. So Nuoc 2030 is largely set in the year 2030 in the Mekong Delta, approximately 100 kilometers south of Ho Chi Minh City, aka Saigon. So the Mekong Delta, which is here at the bottom of the map on my slide, is a vast area of wetlands and rivers that is at sea level now. With its towns, agriculture, and dense populations, it's projected to be at extreme risk from king tides, floods, and rising seas. A brief paragraph at the beginning of Nguyen Vo's film indicates that by 2030, 80% of the population has been evacuated from the area because of climate change. The plot begins with something like a murder mystery. A young fisherwoman, Sao, retrieves her husband T's body from the floating hydroponic farm where he was killed during work. She goes on to find employment at the same farm, perhaps to make a living, but also to find out why and how her husband died. In the first part of the film, we're shown Sao and T in the weeks before T's death in 2030. They lead what looks like the fairly normal life of a poor young couple in the global south. They fish, they grow greens, try to conceive a baby, and live in a house on stilts in the flooded bay where T's land once was. And you see that house here on this slide. Issues of climate justice are implicit in these scenes, and they stage an argument that Indigenous and post-colonial scholars have often made. What's perceived as climate change apocalypse or dystopia in the global north is often already lived reality for communities in the global south. Poverty, displacement, precarious food supplies, and uncertain futures are nothing new for communities that have experienced colonialism in its various forms. So from that perspective, climate change and its consequences are not as new in terms of lived experience as they are in terms of their scientific causes. And by the same token, adapting to climate change involves structures of inequality and struggles for justice that have driven progressive political movements for centuries. The second part of the film foregrounds these inequalities directly. So in that part, the plot flashes back to the year 2020, when a university student named Zhang from Saigon visits the Mekong Delta, and he is there to do research on plans to be engineered for future climate resilient farming. Zhang and Sao meet at a bookstore cafe where she works as a waitress. They fall in love, and she shows him a particular kind of local seaweed that's able to thrive in both fresh and salt water. That seaweed is a breakthrough for Zhang's research. He genetically modifies it so he can turn it into a crop plant that can absorb salt water, obviously a really important asset in the flooded landscapes of South Vietnam and the world at large. But at the end of his research, contrary to what as a viewer you might expect, Zhang leaves Sao, returns to Saigon, and marries into the wealthy family that funded his research and that also owns the hydroponic farm where T works 10 years later. In the third part, the film returns to that time after T's death in 2030. Sao now hears two different stories about her husband's death. T's brother tells Sao that he heard Zhang on the floating farm ordering his men to kill T, so as to punish him for supposedly stealing genetically modified seeds for resale on the black market. But Zhang himself later tells Sao a different story. He claims that he hired T to smuggle seeds out from his family's farm so that they could be made available to the poor, but that then T was caught and killed in the ensuing tussle. So in one case, intentional murder, in the other case, accidental death. Just how reliable the narrator Zhang is not easy to tell, and neither is it clear whether Zhang's continuing or renewed attraction after T's death might have played a role in bringing about his demise. But Sao at least pretends that she believes Zhang's account. So this murder mystery is presented in a slow, quiet, and lyrical mode in stark opposition to the apocalyptic spectacles that dominate a lot of North American films about climate change. And The Day After Tomorrow is, of course, a perfect example of that. Gradually but inexorably, the film transitions the viewer from the familiar hardships of life for the poor in the global South to a far stranger and more unsettling world. And conflicts over property emerge in that context as central nodes of the narrative. T, for example, tries to fight off fishermen who come to fish on his flooded family property, and they get into actually a fist fight over that. They argue that the ocean belongs to all, and when he refuses, they destroy his nets and eat his fish. At that point, he decides that holding on to his flooded land isn't worth the trouble and decides to try to sell it and puts up a for sale sign that sits in the middle of the bay there in the water. Property and ownership also cause conflicts in other ways. In the flashback to 2020, one scene shows Zhang, the student, presenting his research to the executives of the company he works for. Once he shows that he's made the breakthrough that they had hoped for, a moment of tension arises. Zhang wants to use genetic engineering to seed the ocean itself with produce so everyone can harvest it. But the board members suggest partnership with a leading research university and further development of floating farms so as to make the plant a profitable commodity. At the end of the film, that question reemerges in Zhang's claim that he hired T because he wanted the genetically modified produce to become publicly available, whereas the company that employs him, and of course to whose owners he's by then related by marriage, wanted it to remain proprietary. So the question of public versus private property of GMOs emerges as a crucial plot point. But is that GMO plant Zhang's to give away? After all, it was Sao, with her intimate knowledge of the ocean, who led him to the original plant in the first place. Zhang, the graduate student from Saigon, would not have found it on his own. So you could argue that Zhang's academic research originally appropriated Sao's vernacular knowledge without any compensation. So again, the question of what belongs to whom and how ownership functions becomes uncertain in a world that is more ocean than land. And these accumulating questions of ownership and capitalism against the background of adaptation to life in and with the sea gradually convey a sense of a different world in which old laws, practices, and institutions of ownership and dispensation of justice have only intermittent traction. But it's especially the image of a city underwater at the end of the film that drives home to what extent climate change unsettles ordinary conceptions and experiences of reality. So at the end of the film, a typhoon approaches and all the workers leave the floating hydroponic farm. Meantime, Zhang and Sao embark on a submersible that floats gently down and then glides across an underwater cityscape. This is the last scene of the film, and I'll show it to you in a minute. One thing you'll see in that scene is the Bitexco Tower. It's an architectural landmark in Saigon that some people jokingly compare to a stack of CDs with one CD popped out. It's very recognizable and unmistakable. So let me show you the last 2 minutes of NUOC 2030. So the city here is unmistakably Saigon, with the Bitexco Tower clearly visible. And the scene relies on that familiar image of a city drowned by rising sea levels. But what's curious about this is that that scene makes no logical sense at all in the story world of Nuuk 2030, which is set well south of Saigon. So in several earlier scenes, and I showed you one image of this earlier, the city skyline is shown on the horizon. And as you can see, Saigon is well above water, as is, by the way, Sao and T's house, which also is underwater in the scene that you just saw. And of course, the underwater city is lit up here as if the electricity could still be on if it were as flooded as it is. Sao and Zhang then float by that bookstore cafe where they met in 2020. The cafe, the hammocks, and even the books are still implausibly intact. And the scene makes it seem as if it's now the fish reading the books, including one called 2020, in a metafictional allusion to the film itself. So climate change realism here morphs into the imagery typical of French surrealism, with its surprising juxtapositions and self-contradictory metaphors. This mesmerizing combination of beauty and incongruity in the underwater scenes, and there's a lot of them in the film, sends the film's clearest signal to viewers that its futuristic story world no longer corresponds to the old world before climate change. Not because of disasters, destruction, and apocalypse. The typhoon, for example, is not portrayed as a major threat, but because the omnipresence of the ocean unmoors both collective institutions and individual practices. In the same slightly disorienting fashion, Nuuk 2030 turns its portrait of southern Vietnam into a synecdoche for global change. At 3 different moments in the film, the camera pulls slowly back from the unfolding scene to show the landscape or seascape through a fisheye lens that highlights the curvature of the planet. You just saw the last of these scenes at the very end of the film. I want to just show you a couple of others. This is from the flashback to 2020 during the romance between Sao and Zhang, where they're sort of shown just playing and, at a moment of happiness along the seashore, where what we see is the curvature of the planet in the back. Or this scene at a different moment in the film, where we see the flooded landscape of what used to be the Mekong Delta. And again, the camera pulls back and shows us the curvature of the planet. So these are not vistas that any of the characters perceive, but they're ones that the film audience is supposed to see, the planetary story behind the Vietnamese plot. Instead of drawing on the familiar apocalyptic story templates and film images of hurricanes, flood waves, displaced crowds, and destroyed cities, Nguyen Vo draws on the estrangement techniques developed by the high modernist avant-garde. He creates an aesthetically appealing, but also deeply unsettling vision of land, wealth, and culture going underwater with complex consequences for notions of justice. A critique of capitalist modes of acquiring, processing, and distributing natural resources, including land, is at least implicit in this vision. It's far more explicit in Dawson's nonfiction book, Extreme Cities, which holds up a vision of urban communities as a way out of crisis. Some of you might know the book. It focuses, among other things, on New York after Hurricane Sandy. This vision also informs the science fiction novelist Kim Stanley Robinson's New York 2140. Robinson, like Dawson, sees climate change in general and the drowned city in particular as a launch pad for creative possibilities rather than just urban apocalypse. And at the heart of these possibilities lies the reinvention of value and the economic order. Robinson's novel portrays Manhattan in the middle of the 22nd century, after 2 major pulses of ice thaw and sea level rise that have raised ocean water by 60 feet. By current scientific standards, an extreme but not totally impossible future. Under these conditions, Upper Manhattan, which lies 150 feet above sea level, has continued its vertical growth and now sports new superscrapers of unprecedented height. Midtown Manhattan, from about 40th Street southward, has turned into an intertidal zone where waters come and go. Surviving or collapsing buildings are an object of real estate speculation. Lower Manhattan has completely flooded. That kind of scenario is normally the setting for large-scale urban disaster narrative, but it's much more ambivalent in this novel. There's no doubt in the text that sea level rise and increased hurricanes have inflicted heavy damage on New York and the many other coastal cities for which it stands as a proxy. But with its proverbial resilience, New York hasn't just survived, but actually benefited from the flood. The characters variously call it an aquatropolis or a super Venice, fashionably hip, artistic, sexy, a new urban legend. Some people were happy to live on the water if it was conceptualized as Venetian, enduring the mold and hassle to live in a work of art. In fact, to some extent, climate change has catalyzed social change and utopian experimentation. Hegemony had drowned, so in the years after the flooding, there was a proliferation of cooperatives, neighborhood associations, communes, squats, also free open universities, free trade schools, and free art schools. And I'm leaving out a lot of stuff here. This is an enumeration that's about a page long in the novel. But of course, hegemony has not quite drowned. The intertidal areas of New York and other coastal cities have turned into privileged zones of real estate speculation, showing how capitalism itself has adapted to a changing world. Franklin Garr, a stockbroker whose first-person narrative and Bildungsroman-style development over the course of the plot functions as the novel's narrative backbone, not only participates in the speculation on the death and life of great American buildings, he has also created a new stock index, the IPPI, or Intertidal Property Pricing Index, which is designed to help investors profit from this speculation. Because if the intertidal has any value at all, even if it's only $1 million or $2 million, then someone wants to own that, and other people want to leverage that value right out to the usual 50 times, whatever it might be, he says. This kind of speculation can make even risky buildings too expensive to live in for the young and the poor. Rising waters drive some of the characters from their homes. Others find new homes squatting in buildings that can no longer be officially rented. And yet others seem unable to find a home because housing may be unaffordable to them in the first place. A dozen or so different characters whose stories we follow in the novel are tied together by real estate. All of them live temporarily or permanently at the Metropolitan Life Insurance building, which functions as a co-op, which is a typical kind of high-rise organization in New York even now. And I've put them sort of in schematic form on this slide for you. So there's Franklin Garr, the stockbroker, Charlotte Armstrong, a climate refugee advocate who's elected representative of Congress toward the end of the novel, Jen Octaviersdottir, an African-American policewoman, Vladimirovich, a building superintendent originally from Eastern Europe, two computer hackers named Mutt and Jeff who seek to overturn the capitalist market, Amelia Black, an internet celebrity who broadcasts live reports from an airship on endangered species, two illiterate and orphaned boys, Stefan and Roberto, who spend much of their time with a retired historian whose maps they hope will lead them to treasures underwater. So all of these characters come from very different personal histories and social backgrounds. They inhabit the urban space in different ways, even as they also represent larger forces of the market, of politics, and the media. And in addition, there's the voice of someone simply called the citizen, which in some later passages in the novel morphs into the city, a voice that, with its historical memories and social comments, speaks for the city itself. Robinson's model for this structure, for this urban novel, is clearly John Dos Passos's Manhattan Transfer from 1925 and Dos Passos's USA trilogy from the 1930s. These novels, too, break up plot into the perspectives of multiple characters who inhabit the same space, but perceive and experience and remember it in divergent ways. Questions of ownership, property, and economic justice in the face of climate change are central to the plot. New York 2140 is bookended by two attempts to overturn the capitalist order that underwrites real estate speculation of the kind that Franklin Garr practices. So Mutt and Jeff, in the novel's very first scene, hack the international legal code that banking and stock market transactions rely on. They cause a disruption of just a few seconds before their intervention is discovered and reversed. So it's completely ineffectual, although, somebody has noticed, because these two hackers then are kidnapped and held captive for several weeks by shadowy corporate agents, so as to prevent any further intrusions on their part into the workings of international markets. So this signals clearly that the technological elite, however progressively minded, won't be able to bring about any lasting change in Robinson's view. But at the end of the novel, an unusual alliance between masses of consumers and the governments of most nations does lead to an incisive change. Instigated by activists such as Charlotte and Amelia, millions of customers start to withhold payment on their loans, their credits, and mortgages. And that leads to a stock market crash on the model of the one that occurred in 2008. In 2140, governments step in and offer to bail out collapsing banks and corporations, as they did in 2008 and 2009. But this time, they do it on condition that the enterprises cede at least 51% of their stock to the national government. So effectively, the payment strike in combination with government policy leads to the socialization of major banks and enterprises. For Robinson, a step in the right direction, away from the ubiquitous power of private capital. This is anticipated too in the fate of the Metropolitan Life Building itself. The cooperative receives buyout offers at two different moments in the novel, and some of the major characters have to work really hard to secure a narrow vote against selling the building to developers. So the future city, as Robinson portrays it, is not just underwater because of rising sea levels and climate change, it's also underwater in the more metaphorical financial senses. And the novel plays extensively on that metaphorical superimposition of money and water, both in its plot and in its language. Combining a housing index with sea level was one way to view the drowned coastlines, and that was at the heart of what I did. Franklin Garr comments about his financial approach. Stefan and Roberta, the penniless orphans, who are often referred to as drowned rats by the adults, and repeatedly come close to actually drowning on their diving expeditions, do end up locating a sunken galleon and gold bullion worth $4 billion. But then in an ironic twist, that historic treasure has to be kept secret and melted down so as to translate into wealth for these boys in the capitalist market. The novel's first chapter is entitled The Tyranny of Sunk Costs, of which the citizen presents New York City as an example. That is, the money that you've already sunk into a venture and that you can't recuperate. Another part is entitled Liquidity Trap, and another pun on money and water. And there's one whole page of the novel that's simply an enumeration of real and made up present and future idioms and synonyms related to sinking, drinking, drowning, and going underwater. So that omnipresence of water in Robinson's Drowned Manhattan through these plot twists and the linguistic games takes on multiple meanings that include but aren't limited to literal rising sea levels. They also point to social structures, market transactions, and historical memories, all of which shape how the different individuals that populate the novel understand and live with the aquatic city they inhabit. Dealing with climate change in that context isn't just a matter of better technologies, new construction in devastated urban districts, of biological conservation, innovative social experiments, or civic activism, though all of these play important roles in the plot. It's mainly an issue of justice, of reimagining value itself, the processes through which value is attached and removed from places, practices, objects, and people themselves, and how value distribution is connected to the distribution of different kinds of power. In New York 2140, Robinson develops an optimistic vision of climate futures on precisely the narrow template of the drowned city that usually leads authors of speculative fiction to apocalypse. Like Dawson, he sees the flooded city as a starting point for radical social change. But his faith in the power of communities all by themselves is more limited than Dawson's. While the inhabitants of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Building are certainly a prototype community that practices grassroots democracy, Robinson shows that such democracy at a larger scale requires the interventions of technology, personal connections, mass mobilization, and ultimately government intervention. Through his persistent play on water, floods, liquidity, and drowning in New York 2140, Robinson articulates a narrative quest for the more just social order that he often refers to as optopia. So that neologism wants to avoid the connotations of static social structures and political authoritarianism that often come with older visions of utopia. Also, the idea that only a perfect society is worth striving for. Optopia, in Robinson's approach, is the best society you can achieve given the circumstances, less than perfect, but better than current conditions. And unlike utopia, an optopian order is never established once and for all, but requires continuous struggle and defense against the forces that erode it. So what do these different stories of climate justice and drowned cities amount to then? The most effective environmental storytelling typically approaches an unfamiliar ecological risk scenario through a well-known story. Think of Rachel Carson's use of radioactive fallout as a metaphor for describing chemical toxins in the environment back in the 1960s in her book Silent Spring, which was one of the triggers for the emergence of the environmental movement. Writers of cli-fi and climate nonfiction in a similar way portray the unprecedented risks of climate change and climate injustice through age-old stories about the city going underwater. Now that creates a tension in that the old story may make the new risk appear less unprecedented than it is. And that's one of the problems that emerges in Godel's narrative strategy, where, calling something Atlantis makes the risk seem old rather than new, and doesn't seem to open up any way to imagine what climate justice would look like. Wenwu and Robinson fall back on the same story template, but I think they use it in more innovative and unsettling ways. Now, Wenwu, by displacing the flood risk from country to city through his strategy of aquatic surrealism, and Robinson by turning the drowning city from apocalypse to socialist utopia. These imaginative reinventions of an ancient story template in a context of pervasively apocalyptic visions of our planetary future highlight some of the tools that narrative offers to develop future visions that insist on the necessity of optimism. Thanks so much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Heise. That was fantastic. We've got time for some questions or comments, if anyone has any. I always throw in concerns or complaints, but normally no one ever takes me up on that. Sherry, yes, please.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Ursula. Thank you so much for another imaginative and stimulating and really engaging talk. This is terrific. I was really struck. I have not seen the film you were showing us, and I was really struck not only by the visual beauty of those last 2 minutes, that sequence you showed, but also the affect, the really calming, soothing affect of it that was largely aided by the soundtrack. And I was sort of mulling over how even the beauty and surreal quality of the imagery you were talking about could have had such a different affect with different sound, conventionally, coded sound or no sound at all. But I wanted to ask you a totally unfair question, which sounds like I'm asking you to just do like a totally different talk, and that isn't what I mean at all. But something that really stuck with me from earlier in your talk was saying, there are other issues relating to climate change that could affect the city really importantly. And one of the reasons we have this particular narrative is that we have this tradition of narratives. And I was thinking about heat and temperatures and about how what you think of the different time scales of these effects have to do with their narratability and the possibilities for affecting some of these different forms of justice. I mean, even notwithstanding the notion that a lot of times we tend to conflate weather with climate, and people feel as though they experience issues of climate in relation to weather, but that the notion of rising temperatures isn't exactly event-based the way a flood is, and that all kinds of things could fall out of that in terms of our capacity to imagine. I mean, not only that, that's just one example, in terms of our capacity to imagine these other things and also try to address them. I feel like it might have to do with time, but I'd be really interested to hear what you think.
Yeah, it is a really interesting question. I was interested in that too, because it was one of the big reproaches against The Day After Tomorrow, that it collapses for the sake of Hollywood film effect, that it collapses developments that will take years, decades, maybe even centuries to transpire into just a few days, right? I mean, New York City and the whole North American continent freezes over in a matter of days in the film. And this was made fun of, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly. I mean, yeah, it is a film effect. So let me say two things about that. So one is that I'm not sure that heat is not equally narratable. There are a few examples of novels that do tackle climate change by way of heat, and actually some of the earliest ones do. So J.G. Ballard's Drowned World, has a tropical London. Whether that's climate change in the sense that we understand it today in a novel from 1962 is another question, but it's often mentioned as part of the inventory. But there are two early novels, Arthur Herzog's Heat from 1977, and Ignacio de Loyola Brandao's Não Verás País Nenhum, which is a Portuguese novel from Brazil, that's been translated into English as And Still the Earth, from 1981, which both emphasize heat in New York, in Sao Paulo, and in Brandao's vision, the whole Amazon has been deforested and is now the biggest desert in the world. So you have these kinds of visions. Much more recently, you have Bacigalupi's The Water Knife, which represents the American Southwest as completely desiccated. And all of these novels are quite compelling and quite as spectacular as the ones that picture cities or landscapes underwater. So I'm not quite sure that it's impossible to describe that or turn that into compelling narrative. I take your point that it might be more spectacular to describe floods than increasing drought, but writers and filmmakers do find ways to present the two, right? And so I found myself still wondering, well, why is it that the flood narratives so far outnumber the drought narratives? The same is true of something else that's really odd, which is that cold narratives, so narratives of a future ice age, outnumber future heat narratives by an order of magnitude. You have Kim Stanley Robinson's Science and the Capital trilogy from the early 2000s. You have Maggie McGee's The Ice People. You have, The Day After Tomorrow, and innumerable other novels and films that build on what was admittedly in the early 2000s one possible scenario, that is that the Gulf Stream would be disrupted by climate change and that Northern Europe, but not the entire world, and parts of North America might become colder rather than hotter. That's a prospect that the more recent IPCC reports consider extremely unlikely. But it still persists. And again, there too, I have questions about whether it is cultural tradition, literary story templates, and historical memory that prevail here, that for most people in the global north, dating back to the Middle Ages, cold is just a bigger threat than heat. It might be very different in the global south. And we'll see, whether more novels about the threats of heat come out in the future. And you have other incongruities like this, where you also have to suspect that old story templates perpetuate themselves. So, a lot of climate change novels and speculative novels, period, envision future scarcity of food, and even to the point of cannibalism. Think of Margaret Atwood, Cormac McCarthy, it's all over, Eden Lepucki, it's all over the place. Whereas, increasing obesity and things like that don't come into view. So again, is that sort of a centuries old memory where starvation was much more of a risk than an oversupply of unhealthy food? I'm not sure, but that seems to be one of the most plausible explanations. So that's why I'm interested in, okay, what are the histories of these different story templates and how much influence have they had in the past? And that's why I like to call them story templates, because it's not like you can't narrate something else. You obviously can, and you can do so very successfully, but it's what you fall back on when you don't have a reason to come up with something else. Does that make sense at all in response to your question?
It totally does. Thank you so much, Ursula.
Great. Thank you, Sherry. Any other questions? Professor Heise? Yes, Alexa.
Thank you, Ursula, for a really wonderful talk. I was curious about, in either past or emerging narratives around climate change and the sort of specifically, I was thinking more kind of in the fiction realm, about how Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous knowledge holders and ideas have permeated in terms of narrative and writing, and if there's a sense that it's becoming more and more woven together, or it's being actively drawn in by many authors, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and how that might be changing the landscape around how narratives and sort of stories and memorial are being brought to new audiences?
Yeah, I think they've had a really important influence, and that's come both through fiction. I mean, Grace Dillon's anthology of Indigenous futurisms, Sherry Dimoline's The Marrow Thieves, and so forth, where and also through the arguments of Indigenous scholars and philosophers. I mean, I'm thinking here particularly of Kyle Powys White's work, where he makes the argument in several of his publications to say, look, white colleagues, the apocalypse may be a scary future prospect for the white middle class of the global North, but it's actually a past reality for those of us who've lived through colonialism and through genocide and the extermination of and death by disease of large parts of our populations, the loss of our land, the loss of our cultures. And that's an argument that certain post-colonial scholars have also made for literatures that come out of the global South that has experienced colonialism, that this idea of apocalyptic scenarios as a thing of the future rather than of historical memory is actually very specific to the global North. So I think that is beginning to inflect narratives, and I think there's several really interesting things going on there, which is that more recent climate fictions, I think, emphasize a great deal more how climate change will trigger climate refugeeism, right? And that's become sort of a major motif in novels like The Water Knife that weren't really there before. And even in New York 2142, I mean, a lot of the refugees that Charlotte Armstrong works with in that novel are climate refugees. They're not all and not only climate refugees. And as we know in real life, this is also impossible to tangle apart in concrete cases. But so that's become much more, that sort of climate injustice has become much more a part of climate fictions, even written by white male dudes in the global North, than it used to be in the past. So I think that argument is having a major impact on, just political discussions around climate change, but also on the fiction. There are then tricky elements to that. I mean, I remember having a discussion at a conference in Australia about climate change narratives, and one of the Indigenous presenters saying, well, look, my people lived through the end of the last ice age. Maybe there is something to learn from Indigenous knowledge about the transition into a hotter future. I thought that was both a really interesting and totally unconvincing argument, because that transition out of the last ice age took place with populations that were a tiny fraction of what they are today, even in a relatively scarcely populated continent like Australia. So whether any of the survival strategies that Indigenous peoples came up with then would work on a planet of 10 billion people, I think is really open to question. And in the case of Australia also, the question of how a mostly oral tradition, survives 13,000 years, and, what sort of realistic survival strategies you could derive from that, was sort of the other question. So I think there's questions attached to that, but in North and South America, of course, there are much more recent memories and much more recent techniques of resilience that I think it would in fact be really important to draw on, and that I think a lot of environmental activism, especially here in California, has begun to draw on, like in the management of wildfire and such. So I think it is changing both the political discourse and the fictional and non-fictional narratives about climate change.
Thank you so much. It's interesting to hear about the sort of complexities of a lot of these different sources of knowledge, and so I really appreciate the going through kind of the back and forth about how we incorporate them and then what that means in terms of policy too, which you've highlighted. So thank you.
And it gets really interesting in a context like the Vietnamese one too, where deforestation is the oldest environmental problem and a super pervasive one that pits the Kin, which is the dominant ethnicity, against Lao and Thai and so forth in the central Vietnamese highlands that have traditionally practiced swidden agriculture. So there's within countries in the global south, there are also other kinds of confrontations between dominant and minority ethnicities that are super interesting and that don't sort of map neatly onto what we mean by indigenous in the context of European settler colonialism.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. Any other questions for Ursula?
I also wanted to just signal that, I think when Beau's film has been under discussed and underappreciated, it is available to rent on Vimeo for $6 for 2 days. You can check it out. It won some prizes at film festivals in sort of 2014 and 15, but it's not a film that's really super visible. And I appreciate your point, Sherry, that it has that sort of melancholy, but not frantic or completely elegiac and mournful tone that a lot of Western films have. So it is a super interesting experiment.
The soundtrack
climate change there.
Yeah, at the end of that scene was almost oniric, I found in it.
As is the imagery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I was just one of the things I found really, I really appreciated your invocation of the USA trilogy, which was one of those books I found which really marked me in terms of this narrative style. Students respond. I find students still respond to it, even though a lot of it seems dated. And the fact that Kim Stanley Gardner, after writing 3 novels about terraforming, has now turned back to look at how we've formed our own sort of new Earth, like the new Earth that's coming. And I was wondering, have you also noticed, and we saw through the film and the sort of some of the maybe avant-garde techniques with the camera eye in the USA trilogy, sort of giving us a better understanding of the way that technology helps us look at the world and experience the world. Do you see any sort of correlate to that in environmental fiction in terms of like a real sort of avant-garde or new forms of expression? And the one thing that quickly came to mind was the beginning of Overstory by Powers, where it's really being narrated, that beautiful lyric part where it's the tree, right? And that was, so I'm just wondering if you found more of that.
So this is a really interesting question, and it's actually something that I find less pronounced in this Robinson trilogy than in some of the other science fiction novels that also sort of have gone down the Dos Passos route. So to my knowledge, sort of the first science fiction novel that really adopted Dos Passosian strategies was John Brunner's Stand on Zanzibar from 1968, which is not necessarily an environmental science fiction novel, though it does deal with population growth, which of course was an environmentalist obsession in the 1960s, and also with urban violence. And that has entire pages that are split into 2 columns, where you see what's on TV, and you have the images described in one column and the text, what's spoken, on the other column. And there's intense engagement with technology in that novel. Ditto in David Brin's Earth from 1990. And Brunner and Brin are also both actually authors who've done editions of Dos Passos. So they're, it's obvious that there is that connection. So Brin too has these different columns and plays with digital technology as well as visual technology. I think that's less pronounced in this Robinson novel. I think it's there in the Science in the Capital trilogy. Here, I found that it was actually I think it was deliberately adopting a more sort of historical mode, where the citizen often talks like a history book, or like a commentator on the radio or on TV commenting on New York City life. And you find him quoting, Whitman and Melville and New York City newspapers from the 1920s. So it's much more print oriented than some of his other novels. But you're right about the terraforming. I mean, that comes up here indirectly, not as foregrounded as in the Mars trilogy, but it does come up by way of climate change actually re-terraforming New York City and other coastlines into what they were in the late 1800s, because rising seawaters in San Francisco as well as in New York, even here in Los Angeles and Venice, actually, when you look at the outline of what sea level rise will do, well, it'll actually take back some of the areas that were reclaimed over the last 120 years. Tokyo is another great example of that, where a lot of Tokyo Bay that was reclaimed will now be flooded again. So it's that kind of unintentional terraforming here.
Yeah, and there's those sort of classic images of the giant machines taking carbon out of the air, but whereas in the film you were talking how it was GMO or organisms, and even just thinking of how they're hoping to populate put 1 billion oysters in around New York, right?
The oyster texture.
To help protect as well. It's interesting to see, and I guess the interspecies connections there as well in terms of justice that you were talking about before. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I do think Robinson is pretty different from Powers, because you could argue that Powers, for all his investment in the agency and the cognition and communication of trees, at the very end actually does present a techno-optimistic vision in the overstory. I mean, it does end up presenting a vision where humans are able to track the evolution of global ecosystems through digital technology, right? That is in the end the upshot of it. Whereas I don't see that techno-optimism at all in Robinson. I think he's really, really very skeptical of the Silicon Valley elite. And he makes that in New York 2140, but then also in his most recent book, The Ministry for the Future, it's very obvious that he does not think that salvation is going to come from Silicon Valley. And that sort of, I find endearing about him, even as I also think that he then underestimates some of the positive potential of technology up to a point. I mean, he has very advanced technologies in New York 2140, like sort of the way in which the foundations of buildings have been fortified by a particular kind of granitic diamond that they use to keep the water out and so forth. So technology does play a role. He doesn't exclude it, but he's not as invested in it as Powers is.
Yeah. Okay. Any other last questions for? If not, then please join me in thanking Ursula for a fantastic, very thought-provoking talk. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming virtually, and we hope that we can receive you again in person soon here.
I would look forward to that. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been really fun to be with you and talk to you.
Thanks. And I thank everyone for coming out and for all of your support during the term. I will remind you that we still have one event left with the Northrop Frye Center, which will be our undergrad research, day. It will be separate from the research day of Victoria College. We'll send out information soon.